Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com, and today we are in round 6 of our coverage of the 2016 Sinquefield Cup. Been a great tournament so far, lots of exciting matches. If you were not aware, we do have coverage of every single round. If you're watching on YouTube, there is a link below to the website, or you can just go to thechesswebsite.com/Sinquefield 2016. That will also get you there. But today's competitors, White's going to be played by Wesley, so he is currently in second place in the tournament. He leads only one man, and that is his opponent today. Playing the black pieces, we have Topalov, playing a great tournament so far. We did cover the match in round 5, where he played a 6.5-hour marathon session, and by the end of it, you could tell he was fatigued. Afterwards, he said he was just mentally drained, so he's going to be looking to hold on for a good game here, knowing that he spent a lot of his mental energy in round 5. Wesley So, on the other hand, he's looking to win this and propel himself to the top of the leaderboard. So we will go ahead and get started. So starts out with pawn to c4, pawn e5, pawn to g3, knight f6, bishop g2, fianchetto onto the king side, a pawn here d5 after the capture, knight takes on d5, knight c3, knight back here to b6, and then after knight to c6, we do see the 4 knights game in the English opening. Now, it's kind of a different 4 knights game than you're typically used to seeing. This knight's usually over here on c6. We don't see the exchange early on as often in this particular game, but we do see the 4 knights coming out early on in this English opening. Castle on the king side, bishop here to e7, pawn to d3, opening up for this dark square bishop to get involved, and then castle on the king side for Topalov. So continues with pawn to a3, so not being super aggressive with his English opening. Bishop e6, both sides just getting more pieces involved into the game. Bishop here to e3. Knight to d5, attacking. We do see some minor pieces exchange in the center of the board. And then queen to a4. So once to complete his development, which he has done, he'd really like to bring his queen to b3, but that pesky bishop here on d5 is stopping that. So queen here to a4. A rook to e8, and so what both sides are going to be looking to do, anytime you complete your development, that's usually the first thing at high level play. Then you want to start to activate your rooks. You either want to get them on semi-open files like this one, where there's no pawn in front of the rook here on white side, or you want to control completely open files. Or if not, if you don't have any of those, you could always just put it behind some pawns that you look to push. So black would like to bring his rook over here to d8, but right now the queen is there, so later on we're going to see Topalov getting his queen involved and then swinging his rook over and trying to control the semi-open file for black. But for now, we see Wesley So play rook to c1 as expected. A pawn here to a6, and then knight down to d2. And white has tons of options as far as how he wants to continue. He could push forward with pawn here to d4, could play rook to e1, rook to d1 makes sense to me as well. Pawn to h4, pushing on the king side if he really wanted to, or start to move his knight over to the queen side of the board, also open up for his light square bishop to attack. And so that's the route that he chose. I think any of them are fine. They would have definitely changed the end of the game, but he chose that knight to d2. Bishop takes on g2, king recaptures, and then knight down here to d4. After the bishop recaptures, pawn here to d4, and then queen to b3. So as we talked about, getting it to the square he wanted to be before, attacking his pawn on b7. Now there's 2 ways to really defend against this. We have the obvious way, which is rook to b8, and that's actually what Topalov chose to do. I think he just didn't want to go into the tank too much for just mental capacity, because I think bishop to g5 does the same thing, meaning the queen can't just take here on b7, because then the bishop could just take this knight here on d2. So this does stop the attack, but all in all, it's fairly safe to just play rook here to b8. So continues with pawn to e3, and then we see en passant with pawn takes on d3. If you haven't seen this move before, it does look a little strange, but if someone plays their pawn 2 moves, you have one opportunity only if your pawn is right next to it to capture a diagonal like this, and that is exactly what Topalov decided to do. Now, I think it's maybe not the best move in this position, because once the recapture here, then all of a sudden Wesley So has 2 central pawns and black has none. Now it does somewhat expose the king here on the king side, so Topalov really needs to start to get an attack on this king, but his queen and his bishop really only the ones that can attack diagonally with this king, and that's really the only exposure that he has. But he does need to get an attack because as far as the end game is concerned, Wesley So definitely has the slight advantage on board. Rook over here to f8, knight to e4, getting it involved into the action. Queen to d7, so finally completed development, getting that queen involved into the action. Rook to f3, just preparing the rook over here to f1, that double barrel rook. If you are going to triple barrel with the queen, you usually want to get your queen in the center of those two rooks, so it could be queen here on f2. Rook to d8, we talked about this earlier. Getting it in the center, controlling those semi-open files is exactly what black's going to be looking to do on board. Pawn to d4, just stopping that attack. Pawn to c6. Rook over here, f1, just getting behind this rook so we can start to push forward. Queen down here to d5, saying, hey, I'll exchange queens on board with you if you want to. In my opinion, as I look at this from Topalov's standpoint, he's trying to draw the game by this point. I don't think he wants to do anything too crazy. I even think that he looks at So's position and likes it a little bit better. So he would like it if So just traded off queens here and he didn't have to worry too much. So really liked his position. I liked his position as well. So he continues to fight, bring his queen back here to c2. Topalov continues pawn to g6, pawn g4. Rook to e8, just centralizing a little bit, attacking the squares that seem to be a little bit more at risk. There's now this backward pawn here on e3, so attacking that instead. Pawn to h3, just solidifying the pawn chain a little bit on the king side. Bishop back here to d8, opening up the door for this rook to attack the knight. The knight is being attacked by the queen and the rook, so something has to give. He decides to play knight to c3, and that's really the best option. Once this knight moves, so if it were to come here to d2, the rook can now come and take here on e3 because this rook here is tied, protecting the king. He can't move. So have to keep that in mind, and you could see very clearly that rook to f4 would be disastrous, protecting the square here just because pawn to g5 is deadly. The rook now has to move. And at that point, this knight's just going to fall as a freebie. So all in all, So decided to play the best move, and that is knight to c3, forcing the queen to move. After the queen moves, now knight over here to a4. Pawn to b6 is the way he wants to protect, preparing for the knight to come to c5, stopping that. He does have different options, though. He could have played queen to d5, because now if the knight were to come to c5, then we could just see exactly what we talked about before. The rook coming down here, taking on e3. The rook can't take back because the queen is here on d5. So I think that's probably a little bit more aggressive, how I would have liked to play, but he's decided to play pawn to b6. This does stop it, but it also ties his bishop down to this pawn, protecting it, unless later on he wants to try something else with this pawn formation. I usually don't like to tie my pieces up later in the game, protecting pawns. I like to be a little bit more proactive in my approach. Rook over here to c1, just starting to attack, knowing that it's probably a little more difficult on the king side here, since Topalov's done a good job of getting all his pieces over here, protecting the king side. So's going to start to attack on the queen side. Pawn here to c5. We do see an exchange. And before we see some recapture, we first see pawn to b5, forcing the knight to move. I think that's exactly the way to go. Knight back here to c3. Queen here to c6. Queen here to d2. And then we see an interesting move of rook to e5. I think you just have to take here on c5. I see no reason not to after queen takes on c5. Knight comes up here, d5. Queen back here to a7. I think this looks completely fine. I see nothing wrong with that. It's tough to give up material. You saw he gave up that material here on c5 and not get anything back in exchange. He doesn't have all of his materials back here on the 8th ring, so he doesn't have some big attack that he's looking to do. He just plays this rook down here to e5, trying to protect this pawn, but he could just take the pawn if he wanted to. So I thought it was a little strange to play rook down here to e5. Now when the rook comes to e5, we see pawn to b4, just solidifying the pawn chain and pretty much saying, I don't know what's going on because now I just have a free pawn, which is really, really weird. A bishop down here, a g5, a rook to d1, and then the bishop takes on e3. Unfortunately, though, this pawn is not free, and this is actually a big mistake. I'm not sure if he really calculated, but after the bishop to e3, queen up here to d7 is pretty deadly because of this passed pawn here on c5. If the queen takes, then the pawn's just going to start pushing up. That's definitely going to be bad after the rook takes on d7. Obviously, the queen comes back here to a8, trying to hold on, but knight to d5, just getting ready for the knight to actually come here to b6 so it can protect the square here on c8. Unfortunately for black, his bishop is not on the light square, which the promoted pawn would be here on c8. So that's another negative as we kind of look at Topalov's position. Bishop back here to g5, pawn to c6, pushing forward, and then bishop back here to h4. One of those moves where, you know, I just think he's really getting tired because h4 just doesn't make a lot of sense either. Could have instead played rook down here, e2 check, and then maybe king g1, queen c8, queen takes, rook recaptures, rook over here to c3, that's fine. But he decided to play bishop to h4, now rook to d2, and I think he probably should have just pushed here. I'm not sure if he was a little scared about the rook eventually coming down here to e2. But he could have played pawn to c7 and been completely fine. Now if rook to e2, we could see king g1, rook c2 trying to maybe attack there. But then rook to f1 over here, starting to put too much pressure on this f7 square. Black would eventually fall in this position. But after bishop here h4, we see rook to d2. And then rook down here to e1. And if I didn't think bishop to h4 was a good move, I definitely don't think rook down here to e1 is. He's potentially trying to get behind enemy lines with rook here to c1, but it's just too late. Rook to c2 stops any of that nonsense. King to g7, not doing much at all either. Knight to b6 is pretty deadly, attacking the queen, forcing it to move. Also preparing for the push. Pawn here to c7. It has the queen and the rook protecting it. And then the knight's going to be protecting it on this c8 square. Queen to b8. And then queen down here to d4. Check. And in this position, Topalov decided to resign. Now, as always, we'll start to look at some of the continuations. We could say, what if pawn to f6 tries to stop that attack? Well, in that position, just pawn to c7, and then this is just going to be all bad. The queen can't come here to c8, as we've already seen. The knight would just take it. Once the queen moves, the pawn could just come up here. The knight could capture. The rook's protecting it. That's all bad news. So that's one option that's going to be completely bad. If we were to see queen to e5, potentially in that position, the queen takes here on e5. After the rook takes, then the pawn up here to c7. There's no way to stop the promotion without losing significant material. So all in all, Topalov saw the writing on the wall and decided to go ahead and resign. So Wesley, so congratulations to him. Excellent, excellent match. Moves up into first place. Topalov drops to second place for a tie. Hopefully he can get some rest and come back ready to go in the next round because he made quite a few mistakes in this game. Was definitely not at the top of his game, as he has been for most of the tournament. A few moves at the end of round 5. But all in all, he's played a great tournament. So hopefully you guys enjoyed round 6. Been a great tournament so far. Again, make sure you've checked out all of the other rounds if you haven't already. And I will see you in round 7. Thanks for watching.